Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a fine Monday episode of Ask That. We are here and we're going to talk about design. And with me today, I have Damon Sanchez. Damon, how are you, sir?
I'm doing good. Clark, how are you?
I'm doing well myself. So let's get started with introducing who you are and what you do.
All right. Well, my name is Damon Sanchez. I am the Senior User Experience Engineer for Concurrency. It's a company in Milwaukee. We've got companies in Minnesota. We've got companies in Chicago and in Milwaukee at Brookfield, Wisconsin.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
I've been
keep going.
I've been working in the industry about 15 years. I've worked as a creative director. I've worked as an interactive director. You know, when we combine those two fields together, you get somebody who's really passionate about user experience.
And that is certainly something that I like a lot. I like to design stuff, even though I am not a designer, although I do play one on TV. Let's start with just because everybody's not as close to this space as you are or I myself. Let's start with putting a definition around the difference between UX and UI, and what does
Okay.
that really mean for folks?
Absolutely. You know, and that is a question that, you know, as a UX practitioner, you're continually trying to explain to clients, to stakeholders, to the industry. So if you think about user interface is something where, you know, it works down to the granular level of a doorknob or a toaster, right? So when I go to flip on a light switch, the interface of the light switch is, it allows for a switch on and switch off. It's very binary. So the interface itself is me interacting with an object in space. Now, the idea of user experience is something that it's a double-edged definition, in that you can talk about something as a user experience as a total package, right? So, well, what is it about a user experience that somebody likes? At the same time, though, UX can also be used to describe the emotional context of something too. So an example would be, I have a light switch on the wall. What about the color of the light switch on the wall compels me to want to use that over another colored light switch? Or, you know, a lot of times, a classic example of user interface versus user experience is something called a Norman door, right? Donald Norman is a well-known UX expert in the field. He's been doing it for ages. Jacob Nielsen, sort of that. But the Norman door is this idea of, you know, when you go to interact with a door that has a handle for pulling it, and when in fact you're supposed to push the door.
Yep. Yep.
So the idea that, you know, the interface of the door is causing an emotional response of maybe, you know, it maybe makes somebody upset.
Yep.
And so it's a good way to think about it. You know, the interface of the door requires the handle, the affordance of being able to push or pull based on what that door's actual interaction is, causes an experience or an emotional to occur, an emotion to occur, and therefore rendering the experience of the door rendering in a certain way. So.
Sure. Yeah, I often think that we ignore that kind of spectrum of things when we do development, whether it's a website or an app. I mean, there are those who do it really, really well, and most of us really don't. And so I think this conversation is going to be an interesting one, because I think if we can get people to pay attention more to the front of the stack, it'll be a good thing. So I say that because I'm curious. I feel like today it's even more important with the advent of video and audio. I should say advent, but the proliferation of it, right? We have video on an Echo device. We have, audio coming out of our doorknobs. We have refrigerators that talk to us, like all these things. seem crazy in one regard, but our phones, our TVs, like all these things are alive and well. So how do you think, like, one, is that just BS? Is it harder today than it has been in the past? And how do these things play together? Because now we're not really just talking about a web page and a button and and like, hey, it blinked, so I must look there. But it's culturally way more complicated than what we've ever had in the past.
Yeah, I mean, just like you mentioned, I mean, the idea that there are interactions happening all around us, a lot of times what you'll hear is that sort of Cortana, Alexa, Siri, sort of interaction is zero dimensions, right? There isn't really any dimension at all. It's just the voice, right? So you've got 0 dimensions, 2 dimensions, which is the dimension that we're used to using on screen. And then you've got, that sort of 3-dimensional aspects on a 2-dimensional plane. And then you've got like virtual reality, right? There's this whole new augmented reality. So you've got this very rich spectrum of interaction that's happening in the industry today, more so than ever. What's really amazing about being a UX practitioner is that even though some of the methods are different for capturing sort of requirements and understanding that maybe 0 dimension to augmented reality phase, a lot of the process, though, is the same.
Okay.
So the same methods that we're using to acquire user personas, and building a user journey to understand what UI patterns to use for an interface, they're really the same. And so it helps when you're trying to build teams and things like that around a process.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you've used the word practitioner a few times, and I actually very much appreciate that. It's something that I call myself as, even though I have my own business and do our things, I still call myself a practitioner in the sense that it is, in its truest sense, what we do. What does that look like for you? I mean, you just brought up a couple when we go through to figure out if this journey is the same. Like, how do you, the creative director, the UX practitioner, like, what does that look like for you? And is it feasible for somebody like me who's not a creative director to start doing that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes down to it, the really amazing aspect about, what it is that you and I do is that we're humans, right? I mean, when it comes down to it, we have certain avenues or certain properties about us that are destined to fail, in certain situations. We can only process so much information, right? We can always, cognitive processing, regardless of what interface it is a real thing. If we have too much information on the screen, our brains can only process so much of it.
Sure.
If we, the context of use, the affordance, like the doorknob we were talking about earlier, if it has a handle on it, we're all subject to the same, failures and wins, when it comes to that. So really when it comes to becoming a practitioner, a UX practitioner, it's really, the adoption of certain methodologies that help kind of steward that process along. So that's what's really great. I mean, whether you're a developer, a project manager, someone, like a creative director, or an interactive director, the adoption of certain processes can help the process along. So it is attainable for all teams.
So how often do you get involved with the actual end user versus like creatively stalk them to figure out whether or not that doorknob works?
Right.
Where's the balance for you of like talking versus watching?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of times it depends on the project. It depends upon how big the project is, how much time you have, how many team members you have, this sort of research versus using actual data. You'll find a lot of times in the industry, we heard, a couple of years ago, big data became this thing, right? It was like, oh my God, big data. We have all this data. And then it became then the subject or the focus became not on the data coming in, but like, how do you interpret it, right?
Yep.
So the idea that when we're thinking about viewing or, or gathering data, or whether we pick up the phone and call somebody, it really depends on how much information we have at the ready, right? If we know that this two-dimensional interface, there is, a good example, right? Let's say you hear a lot about eye tracking, or mouse movement tracking. Well, let's say that you have an interface that has the major interaction point is the menu in the bottom left-hand corner, and it's a certain color. Well, you can make certain assumptions based on past experiences or past wins of a certain UI pattern that chances are people are going to click on this UI pattern. Yeah. Don't have to go and use eye tracking and things like that. So,
So how often, you mentioned big data. I have to, in this world of machine learning and AI, I have to imagine that you, Damon, start to come up with a set of requirements to give a development team that says, hey, for this thing, could you track it? Could you gather this data so we could use a machine learning type thing to go figure out if any of our theories held true? Is that a real deal?
Yeah, that's completely true. So one of the things that we'll do, I know, we've sort of adopted this model at Concurrency, is just any time that we can incorporate any sort of metrics gathering tools that can work in the process or work in the background, we'll incorporate them if we can. And the idea that while you're starting through like a road mapping process or you're engaged in workshops and things like that, if it is something where you can be asking the right questions, asking sort of like a core set of questions, demographic data, building personas and things like that, you can actually use the data that's being gathered at the same time to sort of validate the stuff that comes through, right? So, we get this many users at this time of day. Well, is that true? You're basing enough of assumption, but that data that you're collecting during that sort of workshop phase can be used to validate some of those assumptions.
Now, what about let's just take a web page. What about at the screen level? Do you get down to like they click this first versus that, and that type of metrics?
Yeah, so click metrics are really handy if you have a user journey sort of already plotted out, right? Okay. So this idea that, well, let's say that you're going to a web page and you can see in the metrics itself that people are clicking on these different areas of the page, right?
Sure.
You could, in theory, just by interviews and stakeholder interviews or, just based on asking questions, you could probably recreate that same experience just through asking questions, right?
Sure.
So one of the things that we'll try to do with data and validation is we'll try to just validate what it is that we just heard from users and from that expected behavior.
Sure. Now, it's not unreasonable to think that we have, a mobile app that works in conjunction with the website that works in conjunction with the device, IoT device or something. How then do you work with a customer to model one's persona across those three things? I worry sometimes that our businesses think of them as three different things, and yet we are still only one person and have multiple things upon us.
And it's tough because that's really where you start to get into best practices, methods, methodologies for understanding the project. You start to try to figure out what is the MVP, right? Is the MVP based on who we know our users are and what their entry point is? It's absolutely essential that in this MVP we have mobile. And when I say mobile, I'm saying under a certain screen size. Let's say a 768. Under 768 is an absolute essential. So that's the MVP. Now, the EVP, the exceptional viable product, would be mobile, tablets, desktop, and then let's say, a really, really high resolution monitor, something like 4K, like that. Now, what's the MVP and what's the EVP? That's sort of dictated on, price and cost and time and, that sort of thing.
Sure. What how do you measure success? I mean, it's one thing to bang out a UI. It's another thing to really design like a very nice user experience that works across these things and that actually captures the hearts and minds so that people are drawn back in. What does success look like?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and sort of touched on it just with the MVP versus EVP, right? This idea that you hear MVP a lot, right? This idea of, well, the MVP, this is what we have cost for. This is what we have budget for. It's the minimum viable product. Well, that's true, right? But when you think about minimum viable product, there still has to be enough shipped that can either be built on that doesn't degrade the user experience. A good example would be a shopping cart, right? The minimum viable product of a shopping cart would be that the icon's in the top right-hand corner, because that's the behavior that everybody's used to having, right? But what if the minimum viable product has that icon or the shopping cart moving around on the page? Well, then the minimum viable product has changed to the point where it's now degrading on the experience because in every iteration it changes, right? But now let's say that the EVP, the exceptional viable product, has the icon in the top right-hand corner, but there's also other features that can be turned on that actually keep the icon in the top right-hand corner, but then build upon that experience. Well, now you're really starting to have success, right? Now there's something that can be built on where you can actually say that, okay, well, we built a really great product and there is adoption that's happening instead of a sort of like in each iteration something happens, right?
But how do you know if that's a result of your user experience? I mean, in that one particular thing, okay, you just kind of cleaned up and like made the house look a little bit better, so we always knew where the doorknob was. Like that works, unless you're at the Apple campus and you just walk into a window. But like what's like how do you measure UX? Because that's hard.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and so that's really where, the idea of that sort of analytics comes in, right? This idea that, well, okay, you've measured before and now you've measured after, and you can see that, maybe the research that you did in the beginning sort of paid off, right? There are more hits to the site. There are more page views. A lot of times you'll find, a big thing right now is in tools that we're using. There's in the Microsoft stack, there's a tool called Cardiolog. One of the things that they're able to do is you turn this on, and then while somebody is using this interface, there's a way to sort of like time out responses. So like, let's say somebody spends over 30 seconds on a search page. You can pop up a little bitty modal that says like, hey, did you find what you were looking for? And then they can rate, based on that. So it's measuring before and then making sure to measure after, almost like when you redo a bathroom, right? You take some pictures, before, and then you take pictures of after, and then you can actually, keep measuring your success. Sure. That's absolutely key. Because, again, a lot of times all of this is just based on questions and answers, right? We're as a UX practitioner, all you're really doing is fostering group consensus throughout the entire process. So the idea that at phase one, you're sort of querying, the stakeholders, you're querying that user base. Phase two, you're doing the same thing. So by the time you've launched, there isn't really any mystery anymore. You've really, it comes to no surprise, the product that you've launched. It's something that everybody has contributed to along the way.
Everybody has kind of their limelight showcase like app that they feel like is kind of best of breed. What do you feel like is a kind of 2018 best of breed user experience?
Wow. Let's see. Yeah, I think, that there's that sort of a long explanation on that. But so, when I started out my career, I went to school as an illustrator and designer, right? So by the time I really got to my senior year, Flash had sort of taken off, that sort of
Yep.
flash development mentality, of the single source of, animation, sound, great user experience, animation, all of it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
just sort of in this one plugin, and at the same time, while that happened, that mobile was
Yep.
happening too. And there was this sort of phase, when Flash died, right? This idea that, and
Yep.
it was interesting because the industry at the time was very plain, but
Yep.
everything about that mobile experience, right? You had Jobs' famous quote of "Who wants a stylus?"
Yep.
And now here in,
Yep.
2018, stylus is back in full effect, So this idea that we've sort of come full circle, so that the experiences that we're seeing now, they have rich typography. Gradients are back, like you see a lot of the Twitter posts that people are posting with like the interfaces that are really popular right now, and everything has got micro animations again. The app icon sort of animates
Yeah.
in, and so I think my favorite UI at this point is probably just the small wins that you see in the so it would either be, I don't know, it's tough to say. As soon as I say one thing, I know I'm going to get hammered for it. But I really I like Pinterest's UI. I
Okay.
think that one of the things that Pinterest has done is it has made small wins in micro animations. I like the small wins that the entire Office suite has made. And I'm trumpeting Microsoft in terms of some of the wins that they've made over the last couple of years, but it really is. If you look at the Office 365 stack, some of the things that they've done on an application level are fantastic. I mean, they've universalized like that sort of bar across the
Yep.
top. Um, they've made some things that were highly complex very simple, and easy to use from an installation standpoint all the way through using it.
Sure.
I think that's something that a lot of large scale applications can't really say that they've done that well. I
Sure.
mean, and so that's something I think, Microsoft has to give them a pretty good pat on the back for that. I mean, it's
Sure.
easy to make a public facing web page look great and seamless, but when you take something the size of like Microsoft Word,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
have
You've got a few users.
yeah,
Yeah.
you've got a few user base, a few users under your belt to make happy. So
Yeah.
that was
What do
my
you?
45-minute explanation.
Yeah. So I personally, I'm really, really excited about where we sit today because I feel like I feel like we're at this like inflection point in industry where we have all these things, right? IoT is kind of a new thing, not new, but it's certainly achievable or in reach of everybody, all the way down to, the person in their house. And you take that and you take this proliferation of devices, whether it's the Alexa or our phones or the devices, as my Alexa's going off, um, the Nest on our walls, and you think about that experience, and it's for the first time for me. I feel like we have this convergence of how computing can actually change our life, and not just like augment, hey, I got to do some word processing stuff, but
Right,
actually like, hey, I walked into the room, turned the heat up, and then you
right,
think about how design, if we really talk about invoking an emotion, like what does that mean when it's not just how I interface with my hands or in front of a device, but it's the movement throughout the house, it's the lighting that changes with it.
right.
It's become so much bigger than like the
A street.
keyboard and
Yeah,
mouse and the web page, and it is really about human life.
yeah.
And that like really, really excites me because it's completely in reach. It's not,
Hmm.
some Star Trek like Never Never Land. It's certainly
Right.
here in some capacity.
Well, I mean, and like you said, I mean, this idea that it's so all encompassing now. It's so ubiquitous, right? That it's becoming less about the how I'm interacting with a button on a screen and more about the psychological aspects of having this sort of technology all around me. Well, I walked into a room, like how was the emotional language, or how was that natural language used by this device, and how is it interpreting what I was saying, and how does that make me feel, and so now it's not even about a screen, it's about the room I'm in,
Sure.
and which is interesting. We were talking about research, just earlier, data itself, and I think that is another area where the analytics of how we gather data for UX purposes, that's definitely in the process of being reinvented and reimagined. I mean, because, it's not about eye tracking anymore. It's about, hey, this person walked into a room and the wall and spoke to no interface at all. They've just, and how do we gather that data aside from sending somebody to the room with a notebook?
Sure. Yeah.
What it is they're saying. I mean, and it's a little bit scary, when you think about it, because now we're talking about environmental tracking and things like that, I mean, this, but it's awesome, and it's so neat to be in the industry at this time, and, yeah.
There was a day when we were worried about Google reading our email, right?
Right.
Oh my goodness, they're searching through our email, and you think about where we are today, and it's like, you have every camera and Alexa and everything, and you could care less.
Well, I think one of the most interesting articles that I've read, so I am a member of the Interaction Design Foundation .org. It's a great tool for people to learn. I mean, here we're, we're veterans in the industry. I still like using the tool because it's just this great experience. But there was an article about autonomous cars. This idea of like, well, and the sort of ethical question of whether or not, if this car is driving down the road and it sees, a group of people, how does the programming figure out what to do in that situation?
Yeah.
And it was, that's where we're at right now in the industry is, how does that correspond to how we deal with application building and development? Incredible.
Yeah. How do you think things like 5G affect UX?
There's always going to be a new realm of, speed, a new realm of technology, some other form of integration. But, like we talked about, coming full circle again, this idea that we're humans, when it's all said and done, we have to deal with cognitive processing. We have behavioral affordances that, we're used to using. And so the faster you can get those things accomplished, the better off you would assume an interface could be.
Sure.
But in the end, though, we can only process so much information. So even though it might be faster, we're still stuck as human beings, until we get the chip.
Yeah, I asked that question in part because it does kind of unlock, it seems like that next big barrier to all of our things talking together in a way that we really haven't thought about it before. If it is semi-instantaneously, then how does that unlock some interaction paradigm that we're just not used to, from either our computer to the Alexa to the Nest to the me walking through the room and it being able to predict like the other 3 rooms that I'm about to walk through. And I know they were doing a bunch of stuff at the Olympics where they were actually using 5G and streaming like from the bobsled down, and it was things that they could have never done before, and it was simply because now they can mount a camera to the thing and it's wireless and it's batshit fast. And so you know, what can you do then? Well, now you think of a user experience where you can overlay all the accelerometer data and all that, and it's like, right, this thing is moving. I don't know if that's in fact what they did or not, but at least it's feasible, right? Because now you can load the thing up with whatever you want and
but again,
really change it.
You touched on this. I always think of, have you ever seen the inside pictures of an airplane cockpit, right?
Yeah.
it's unbelievable, the amount of analog and digital gadgets that are in front of the pilot, right? But it turns out though that, the pilot's not really even flying the plane anymore. It's more algorithms and codes that are being punched in. So I think that it really is though, even though things are becoming faster, we might have more dashboard, sort of being pulled in all at one time, or more displays. But there is always going to be that UX to pick and choose like what it is that is important to project to the user, at the particular time. So it's,
Sure. All right, before my last question, I want to extend a bit of gratitude to you for not only being on today's lovely edition of Ask That, but also for sharing in the community that you do and speaking at your website's got all kinds of great information on it. And so thank you on behalf of me and everybody who's ever looked at it, and to all the designers out there who put up with everybody who does not know the difference between UX and UI. Thank you for not beating the piss out of her going, they're not the same thing whatsoever.
well, thank you for having me. I mean, I'm glad to be doing this, and I hope we can do more of these,
Yeah,
I mean.
Absolutely. I love the design space. So that brings me to my last question of, I'll put the designer, and I'm using kind of quotes around, I know that that's a very simplified view of what people do, whether it's interaction design to print to whatever. But as the designer, like what advice, how would you guide somebody who is building product and wants to build a good experience but doesn't have designers kind of at resource, or is trying to influence their organization to be more just thoughtful of, hey, I know you said to go get that template off of Template Monster, but it's shit, and I don't know how to convince you like our users won't use that because I'm not a designer. So like, what would your advice be to like do good in this world of overwhelming stuff that we have?
Right. I mean, in the end, it's about the user, right? It's about understanding who it is. So if you could start any conversation or get any sort of process started that has inertia about it, it's just simply understanding who it is that you're talking to and who it is that you're building the application for. Because in the world of templates, right, in the world of frameworks and, hey, let's just go get Bootstrap and turn it on and color it, green, and our logo's green, and boom, we're done. I mean, the idea that, that you can always do that, right? I mean, there has been great care and feeding in building some of those frameworks so that you can use them off the shelf. The catch is that just the simplified branding of a color or a theme on top of another framework, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the user who's using it, right?
Sure.
And that, if you can start there, that sort of has enough inertia to help you build teams, right? Because when it comes down to it, when you start asking some of these core questions, and there really are core questions. I know, that's sort of here, you can't just grab something off the shelf and just use a framework. But with that said, though, there are still core questions that you can ask from a UX perspective that get the ball rolling, right? I mean, and a good example, I use this example in a lot of my sessions, and, think about asking questions to stakeholders and them coming back with the response. Well, my users are between 18 and 65. They're both male and female, and they're technologically savvy and they're not technologically savvy. Well, it's like, now that we're talking about Chicago, all right, let's go build this thing.
Yeah, we nailed that down.
Right. Well, we've got some definition around this application. Yeah. So the idea that you can always get more granular in your questions, but the wider net that you cast, the less about the user experience you're going to get, right? And so you're going to get less adoption and more functional the wider net you cast.
Sure. Is there some place people can go to get some of those core questions that one can ask?
Yeah, I mentioned the Interaction Design Foundation. That's a great place. There are, I have sort of some core questions, some UX questions posted to the concurrency blog, the place I work for. We've got a couple PDFs you can download. But really, when those sort of core sets of questions, you can find them on various blogs. And what's interesting, you'll know you find the core set of questions when they start to repeat themselves, right? The idea, it's a mixture of demographics, it's a mixture of emotional language, it's a mixture of sort of the interface. So to help answer that a little bit more, is you're really looking at a mixture of interface questions, emotional questions, demographic questions, and sort of behavioral questions. And if you can sort of culminate those together, you'll get enough to sort of move forward.
Okay, I like that. Yeah. That's a good way to end. And we'll link up some. We'll put the links to that in the description and all that stuff below.
Okay.
So with that is another glorious edition. Leave some comments below for Damon and I, and we will answer them as promptly as we can. Give us a thumbs up. Share it with your friends. Share with the world.
That's my pointer to the information below.
You did well. And Damon, how do people get a hold of you?
You can, my website is just damonsanchez.com. My handle on Twitter is darkriderdesign. And I work for Concurrency. And you can go to concurrency.com and find me there.
All right. Perfect. We will put that all in the notes. And with that, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Should have asked that.
Clark, thank you.